All right, let's talk about Christopher Columbus. He's one of those names from history that everybody knows, but his story is, well, it's way more complicated than you probably learned in school. We're going to look at the man, his famous voyages, and a legacy that, even centuries later, is still a huge point of debate.
But really, this whole massive story boils down to one central question. How did one man's monumental, almost unbelievable mistake end up completely reshaping the entire planet? I mean, think about that. Let's get into it.
So it all kicked off with a plan that was built on some seriously flawed geography. See, Columbus wasn't actually trying to discover a new world. His goal was way more practical. He was just looking for a shortcut, a faster sea route to Asia.
And this is the kind of map that was firing up his imagination. He was looking at charts like this one from a geographer named Toscanelli, who basically thought the world was a lot smaller than it is. These maps dramatically, and I mean dramatically, underestimated the size of the ocean between Europe and Asia.
And just look at these numbers. It's kind of staggering. Columbus figured the trip from the Canary Islands to Japan would be about 4,400 kilometers. The actual distance, almost 20,000 kilometers. It's not an exaggeration to say that if the Americas hadn't been sitting right there in the middle of the ocean, his entire crew would have starved to death long before they ever saw Asia.
So you have to ask, how could he get it that wrong? Well, it wasn't just one mistake. It was a perfect storm of errors. First, he used calculations that basically shrunk the size of the Earth by about a third. Then, he believed the continent of Eurasia was way bigger than it actually is. And to top it off, he was taking travel stories from people like Marco Polo and even tales of mythical islands as solid geographic fact. It was a recipe for disaster, or, as it turned out, discovery.
Okay, so that's the plan. But what about the man behind it? Who was this guy who was so completely convinced he was right, even when all the experts were telling him he was wrong, that he'd spend years and years begging kings and queens to fund his crazy idea?
Well, Columbus was a mariner from Genoa, and he was largely self-educated. He was incredibly ambitious. What drove him was this potent mix of goals. On one hand, he was after wealth and titles, gold, land, you name it. But on the other hand, he genuinely saw his voyage as a holy mission, a way to spread Christianity across the globe. And let me tell you, this guy was persistent. It's actually kind of incredible. He spent the better part of a decade shopping his idea around. He gets rejected by the King of Portugal in 1484. He pitches it to Spain's monarchs, and they basically say, we'll think about it, and hand it off to a committee. He goes back to Portugal and gets rejected again. But finally, in 1492, something changes. Spain has just finished the Reconquista, and Queen Isabella is looking for a new way to get a leg up on her rival, Portugal. Suddenly, Columbus's incredibly risky plan doesn't seem so crazy anymore, and he gets the green light.
And so, with funding secured, we get to the voyage itself. This is the part of the story that leads to one of the most pivotal, world-altering encounters in all of human history. So, on August 3rd, 1492, Columbus and his crew set sail from Spain. You have to imagine it. 3 small ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, heading west out into this massive, completely unknown Atlantic Ocean. They were literally sailing off the map, all based on Columbus's deeply held belief that the East Indies were just over the horizon. After 5 long, tense weeks at sea, with the crew getting more and more restless, they finally spotted land on October 12th. He'd landed on an island in what we now call the Bahamas, an island the native Taino people called Guanahani. This was it. This was the moment that 2 halves of the world, separated for millennia, collided. And his own journal from that very first day, it's incredibly revealing about his mindset. He writes this about the Taino people he met. They should be good and intelligent servants. I believe they would become Christians very easily, for it seemed to me that they had no religion. Right from the jump, his view wasn't about mutual discovery. It was about utility, what these people could be for him and for Spain. And that really set the tone for everything that was about to happen. Because very quickly, Columbus's role changes. He goes from being an explorer to a colonial administrator. And his time as governor of these new territories, well, it would become a story of brutality, mismanagement, and ultimately failure. You can see this progression over his 4 voyages. The first one is all about first contact. But by the second voyage, he's back with 1,500 men to colonize. This is when he introduces the encomendia system, which was basically a system of forced labor for the native people. It was absolutely brutal. And things got so bad that by his third voyage, his own government arrested him for being a tyrant. You see, as governor of Hispaniola, he was under immense pressure to deliver on his promises of finding mountains of gold, but the gold just wasn't there. So that frustration boiled over. You had rebellions among his own Spanish settlers and just horrific, extreme violence directed at the Taino people, all in this desperate search for gold that didn't exist. Then you have a number like 500. What does that mean? Well, in 1495, Columbus rounded up about 500 indigenous people, Arawaks, and shipped them across the Atlantic to be sold as slaves in Spain. It was one of the first major transatlantic slave voyages. Hundreds of them died on the journey. Finally, the reports of his mismanagement and sheer brutality got so bad that the Spanish crown had to send an investigator to see what was going on. And the result was just shocking. The great admiral of the ocean sea, the man who discovered this new world, was arrested, stripped of his power, and sent back to Spain in chains.
So all of this, the discovery, the colonization, the tyranny, it leads us to the lasting consequences of his voyages. And this is where we get into a legacy that completely transformed our world and is still being fiercely debated right now.
Probably the single biggest consequence of all this is something we now call the Columbian Exchange. And this wasn't just about people meeting. This was a massive, planet-wide transfer of plants, animals, culture, technology, wealth, and crucially, disease. It was the event that really kicked off the age of globalization as we know it. And the scale of this exchange is just mind-boggling. Think about it. Things like wheat, sugar, and horses, which totally revolutionized life in the Americas, came from the Old World. In the other direction, Europe got things like corn, potatoes, and tomatoes, which completely transformed their diets and helped their populations explode. But along with the crops and the animals came something much more sinister. Because for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, this exchange brought nothing short of a catastrophe. Old world diseases like smallpox and measles, illnesses to which they had absolutely no natural immunity, were unleashed on them. These diseases tore through communities, leading to a population collapse so devastating it's hard to even comprehend. And that brings us to today. On one hand, you have places where Columbus is still celebrated as a hero, a pioneer, with grand monuments in his honor. But on the other hand, you have places where those exact same statues are being torn down, where the pedestals now stand empty. It's a perfect visual for the two competing narratives we're grappling with. So we're left with this massive, complicated question. There's no doubt his voyages connected the world in a way it had never been before. But the question is, at what cost? How do we balance the beginning of our modern globalized world against the absolute devastation it brought to the people who were already here? Over 500 years later, that's a debate we're still having.